Peatlands are fascinating biotopes and carbon sinks, but most have been drained, with severe consequences for the climate.
That's why it's incredibly important to protect peatlands, not just the living ones, also the ones we've drained.
They also hold enormous potential for agriculture too.
What we really hope is that farmers will see this, they'll see this working at scale.
A new form of agriculture that protects peatlands could become crucial in fighting the climate crisis. A green striped patchwork emerges from this vast agricultural landscape. The stripes may be the key to saving peatlands. Most of these wetlands in Germany have been drained, a major risk for nature. Greta Gaudig and Matthias Krebs are working to raise awareness of the destruction and reverse it. The damage is easy to see when looking at the peat.
Underneath, everything's been well preserved, and above, where it's dry, it's being lost. When a peatland is drained, it decomposes. We can see that here in this sample, where the very dark upper layer shows a lot of decomposition.
The peat in the soil is made up of dead plant material with large amounts of carbon. The carbon is stored in the peat as long as it's wet. But draining exposes the peat to oxygen and plant materials begin to decompose. Carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, is then released into the atmosphere.
Peatlands are multi-talented. They do so much. Their biodiversity is very important, but so is their function as carbon sinks. That's why it's incredibly important to protect peatlands, not just the living ones, also the ones we've drained.
Peatlands have been Greta Gaudig's passion for more than 20 years. She's been researching and fighting to have them resaturated the entire time. Germany's peatland landscapes cover around 1.8 million hectares, over 95% of which have been drained, primarily for agriculture. The consequences have been devastating. Drained peatlands are responsible for about 7% of Germany's CO2 emissions. By comparison, domestic flights only account for around 0.15%, roughly 50 times less. Greta Gaudig hopes to work with farmers to turn peatlands back into champions for the climate, a real and muddy challenge.
We're wearing snowshoes because we're walking over a very wet peatland area. Without them, we'd sink in, even wearing rubber boots.
The team is researching how farmers could adapt here. Reflooding the fields means they'll have to turn to alternative farming methods. Greta Gaudig already has some ideas about the treasures peatlands could offer.
Did you find it, Keno?
Yes, 262.
A water level monitoring station is hidden in this field, surrounded by sphagnum moss. A typical peatland inhabitant and a potential crop for a new form of agriculture known as paludiculture.
It comes from palus, Latin for swamp or marsh, and refers to the cultivation of wet peatlands.
Gaudig has been fascinated by sphagnum moss since she was a student. Moss is a long overlooked crop. Now she's writing a kind of user manual for paludiculture.
I don't want to do science that's then just put away in a drawer. I want to see it in action. This is a completely new form of agriculture.
And perhaps soon the start of a revolution in flower pots. Peat-based soil is the most common soil used in gardening and when growing vegetables. The peat is still being extracted from peatlands worldwide, a death sentence for wetlands. Gaudig wants to replace peat in potting soil with sphagnum moss, but that can only work if growing it is viable. Machinery is being tested for field management. Only the top layer is removed, keeping the precious soil intact. This moss sample will show how productive fields can be.
Wow, that's really heavy.
The moss will be dried and weighed to determine its potential yield. The European continent's largest peatlands lie to the north. They provide both refuge and a habitat for rare species in the vast expanses of northern Finland. But many wetlands here too have been destroyed to make energy from wood and peat. Tero Mustonen has proven peatlands can be saved. He's a climatologist and environmental activist known around the world as a report writer for the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
It almost feels like Linnunsuo is kind of a person. You see some kind of a presence here. For example, this wood piece that I'm now looking at may potentially be 2,000–3,000 years old. I often want to think that peatlands are the memory of Finland.
This wetland would be a thing of the past without Mustonen. The 48-year-old is an expert on restoring damaged peatlands. And it all began here, in the Linnunsuo peatland near his hometown.
Because it has taught us everything we have needed to learn in order to make this a national program. And from that we started to learn and test and innovate. How can you restore a large peatland system?
A mammoth project covering 110 hectares. A corporation mined peat here for decades to make fuel, leaving behind a desert of destruction and poisoned rivers.
It was severely impacted by human decisions for economic gain and energy production that had disastrous results. There was a fish death event and, of course, these impacts to climate because they are active carbon sources even after the mining has stopped.
His environmental organisation Snow Change sued the company and won. The suit halted the extraction of peat for the first time ever in Finland. Snow Change then purchased and restored the land, giving nature a second chance. But is the peatland working properly to help save the climate? Spanish ecologist Alicia Harma-Busquel wants to find the answer.
We want to know if the CO2 or the methane are going up in the sky or this restored wetland is acting like as a sink, carbon sink place.
She captures and measures greenhouse gas emissions from the peat soil using a plastic dome. The results are encouraging. Their fight is paying off. Nature is slowly but surely reclaiming the wetland after decades of exploitation. The peatland is once again fulfilling its original role. While the drained peatland once emitted 400 tonnes of CO2 each year, the restored ecosystem now absorbs 100 tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere each year. What began locally has become a nationwide mission. Donations and investment fund about 100 snow change restoration projects in Finnish peatlands. The successful restoration of Linnunsuo shows what's possible. Migratory birds that had long vanished are back, along with over 200 other plant and animal species.
This place shows that with persistence, courage and scientific commitment, we can still have a chance. And that's the biggest message we can tell from Linnunsuo.
A message from Europe's far north that resonates worldwide. The Greifswald Moor Centrum in northern Germany is the country's most important research facility for peatland conservation and the birthplace of paludiculture. Greta Gaudig uses her lab to study the plants she's cultivating in the wet peatlands and investigate their economic potential.
This is peat moss biomass. We're going to dry it and weigh it to determine the potential yield for a farmer.
Paludiculture will only succeed if farmers can earn enough. Moss could have enormous potential as a component of potting soil.
Peat mosses contribute to climate protection in two ways. First, they replace peat in horticulture, substituting a renewable resource for a fossil one. Secondly, peatlands are re-wetted for peat moss cultivation, which helps prevent the high emissions currently released from drained peatlands.
Lab research and initial field trials are progressing well. Greta Gaudig is confident it can scale for mass-market applications. Landscape economist Sabine Wichmann is looking at how pervasive this new form of land management needs to be to become economically viable.
We need to establish more peat moss areas, hundreds or thousands of hectares. We have to convince farmers and landowners, and high investment is also needed.
An equation that only works if there are buyers as well as a market for peatland products. But not just for peat moss. Sabine Wichmann is studying other crops that could also thrive on peatlands. The economist and a colleague have donned knee-high rubber boots to venture into a cattail jungle. They planted this multi-hectare field on re-wetted peatland 5 years ago.
Are we still on the right path? Should we check the GPS for distance and direction?
Yep, let's try.
Paludiculture is not yet profitable for most farmers. Wichmann wants to change that.
My parents are both from farming backgrounds, and I've been passionate about wet peatland use for 15 years. There's still a lot to do, and it's great that we're able to work with farmers.
None of it's possible without them, and they too stand to benefit from the innovative use of land. Aside from moss, cattails, on account of their resilience and versatility, are particularly promising. Cattails even thrive during droughts and handle heavy rainfall well. The plant is also very sturdy, an ideal building material.
Here you can see what's needed for construction and insulation materials. An airy structure that insulates well, is very light, and also forms stable load-bearing elements.
Cattails are also suitable for making durable building materials and insulation for houses, down substitutes in clothing, for producing paper and cardboard, and even for generating energy. But political support is still needed to stimulate new markets and offer farmers security. Progress is already being made. The German government pledged in 2024 to fund several pilot projects on reflooded peatlands.
I'm convinced that this is a great opportunity to create synergies between peatland conservation, sustainable agriculture, and the supply of renewable resources. That's what we need to tackle climate change and create a habitable future.
Processing cattails into something useful is the next hurdle.
Hello, good morning, boss.
How's it looking?
Yes, the water level allows us to let a bit of water back into the moor.
That's good.
Irena Kalinin wants to flood the moors and peatlands again. What might sound simple is actually very complicated. A lifelong mission for the water management engineer. Like most moors, the great meadow of Friedland was drained over decades to make way for agriculture. To re-wet it, water must be directed from the surrounding area. But there's no longer enough water.
Changes in water management within the catchment area have dried up many small ponds, and the groundwater has lowered. The moor down here is now naturally lacking water. If I don't have the water reservoirs anymore, then I can't get water here either.
That's why Irena Kalinin is pumping it from a distant river, which itself doesn't always have enough water. The water flows through artificial ditches in the moor in a checkerboard pattern. The problem lies in the surrounding area, which is supposed to supply the moor with water. About 30% of the natural waterways in the catchment area now flow through artificial pipes deep underground. The pipes dried out the landscape for agriculture. Irena Kalinin and co-worker Sarah Paul are now working to reverse the efforts. Back then, the consequences for the climate were unforeseeable. A stream has flowed through these pipes for decades. Now it'll flow freely again. When running water is confined, adjacent soil is unable to retain water and dries out. Free-flowing water changes that.
The open stream ensures that the soil can get moist again on both sides. Little lakes can sometimes form in the depressions, allowing water to remain longer in the area. By retaining the water for longer in the landscape, I can have a longer and more reliable flow into the moor. I don't have these abrupt periods where a surge comes and then a dry period follows, like we have now.
The Rataya stream has been released and can now flow above ground in its old stream bed. Irena Kalinin and Sarah Paul have fought for more than 2 years for this moment. They needed funding and the approval of landowners and authorities. Convincing farmers in particular wasn't always an easy task, but the time has finally come. A resounding success. The duo hopes to convince even more landowners to uncover the streams that run under their fields. But that can also spell financial losses, especially for farmers.
There are farmers who have large areas who don't want to give them up. They shy away because of all the regulations covering free-flowing streams. For example, they can't fertilise within 5 metres of a stream, and they'd rather avoid that. They want high yields right up to the stream's edge, which isn't possible, and that makes it a little difficult.
Irena Kalinin offers farmers land exchanges to help, but extending peatland protection also requires more support for farmers to support the transition. Some pioneers in the southwestern United Kingdom are showing how it can be done. Dozens of sacks of cattails are being stored in this warehouse, many of them from Sabine Wichmann's research field in Greifswald. Finlay Duncan and co-worker Antonia Jara are already marketing the spoils of paludiculture. They rely on just the furry heads of cattails.
They're looking in good condition. I think they're going to feed in pretty well. The fibre is good quality.
No, very fit stock this year. And so what we do is that we process these seed heads, and then with the extracted fibre that you can see here, we produce an insulation.
Their startup, Ponder, produces a warm padding material for clothing, a profitable success story for paludiculture.
The reason they've been drained in the first place is to allow farmers to grow conventional crop. Once we go in there and we re-wet and restore the wetland, the question arises of what can the farmer do with the land now that it's in a wet conditions.
They launched Ponder together with two friends. The idea came to them during a road trip through England when they were looking for native plants for sustainable textiles. The soft seeds of the cattails were exactly what they were looking for.
Okay, it's looking really nice. It's been coming through really clean. So now we have a nice clean fibre that can head on to other processing, whether it's on to produce our loose fill or our padding or wadding material.
The company produced about 4 tonnes of cattail padding in 2024. They're trying to win over local farmers to be able to produce more in the future. Ponder's Finlay Duncan visits a new producer in County Somerset, where many peatlands were also drained for agriculture. Farmer Will Barnard re-wetted a field in a dry peat moor earlier this year and planted cattails. The British government funded the project to find real-world uses for paludiculture. The farmer still isn't sure how to grow his new crop.
The hydrology is suppressing almost everything here, allowing the typha to grow. But we're finding this swamp buttercup, we can't use any herbicides on it because it's a wetland. In the Netherlands, they rogue it, they pull it out by hand, which is fine for small scale production, but I don't think that's going to be viable at large scale.
And this will survive higher water as well, you think?
It seems to survive higher water admirably.
The plant is competing with cattails for space. Will Barnard is now testing various ways to control the weed without herbicides. Many things are still experimental. He's also experimenting with machinery. He used a drone to sow the cattails because a tractor would have sunk into the mud. And solar-powered pumps direct water onto the field to raise the underground water level. Dams and ditches had to be built around the field so that water can be pumped onto the farmlands and the cattails can grow.
Being an island of wet in a sea of dry is a really challenging space to be, and that is not why we're doing it. We're not expecting these sites to sit in isolation. We are hopeful that the whole landscape will transition and these sites will sit where they are more naturally useful.
The farmer's convinced that this new form of agriculture will become profitable. It could start filling his pockets as early as next year.
There'll be the initial sale of seed heads to Ponder for inclusion in their insulation production lines. We're hoping that the stems will be viable for either biomass to go into energy production or fiberboard for housing construction projects.
The carbon offsetting, nutrient removal, other things like flood prevention as well are all benefits of this crop, and there's potential to build those into a model that we can offer to farmers. So there's a package which makes it a much more tempting offer to kind of move into this type of agriculture.
Will Barnard is a pioneer, but interest is growing. Other farmers have already stopped by to learn about this new form of agriculture. A company outing for the Ponder team. They too want to know more about how their raw material is grown.
We are here to harvest. We've got, we're going to go in right here, and then there's kind of it should be a fairly dry field where we're just going to start off. But in general, there are some bits that are a bit wetter, it's a bit squelchy, and there's some actually deep pond bits as well.
Since British farmers can't supply enough cattails yet, today they're harvesting cattails growing naturally in the Grey Lake Nature Reserve. It doesn't harm the ecosystem, and it's a special experience for the Ponder team.
They're all kind of like working towards this new material, so it's nice to bring them to the origins of it so that everyone knows exactly what is the plan we're working, how the landscape of a wetland is.
The start of a new use for peatlands. Even more farmers will be following Will Barnard's lead and will harvest large cattail crops from their fields for the first time. A sign of a new beginning.
There's about 330 million hectares of degraded wetlands globally, and what we really hope is that farmers will see this, they'll see this working at scale, and then we can work to really implement this across the globe really.
The peatland's potential in saving the climate is enormous. A new approach to peatland management that could benefit everyone.